Welcome to Lore Citizen, a podcast dedicated to all things Star Citizen lore. If you enjoy this, make sure that you like, subscribe, and follow all of our social medias. Without further ado, let's get started. Content warning for violence, mentions of genocide, abuse, child abuse, civil war, assassination, and general violence. It's going to get a little grimdark for this episode. So, hope you enjoy. Welcome back to Lore Citizen. It's been a long time. It's been, I think, 3 months. Life catches up to all of us. So we've been super busy. It didn't help that we had both the anniversary sale and CitizenCon. I think the last time we did it was in September, so that it wasn't too bad. So we had those two things catching up. So I figured we'd continue with this with our discussions. As always, I have Jale and Al with me, but I also have a new voice you'll hear pretty soon. But first, Jale, why don't you get started? Who are you? What do you do in Star Citizen? Where can they find you?
I'm Jale. I'm mostly known for doing alien language stuff and this podcast. You can find me on Twitter, and you can find my YouTube channel under the name Jale.
There you go. Al, who are you? What do you do in Star Citizen? Where can they find you?
Oh, Paul, you know me as Old Man Hurston.
Old Man Al Hurston.
Old Man Al Hurston, compliments of Paul. I'm one of the info runners. I love Star Citizen. I love lore. I occasionally stream as a solo noob character, just a tune. But yeah.
Awesome. And a new voice you'll hear more often, because he's been asking to come on, and here's Mr. Space Tomato.
Hello.
Who are you? What do you do in Star Citizen, and where can they find you?
Well, I'm Space Tomato, as you said. I like lore. I don't get to get into it very much, so I don't know much about what's going on, but I like to hear about it, so I'm here. But I mainly make... Yes, teach me! I make YouTube videos primarily, but I also stream. I now have a website with a blog, and I do a couple things with communities in Discord and stuff like that. So the best place to find me is spacetomato.gaming.com, or you can find me on YouTube under Space Tomato, which is pretty straightforward.
Awesome. He's going to be our straight man for this episode. He's going to ask questions.
Yes.
So those of you who are like, I have no idea what anything was just said. So
I am you. I'm clueless.
So he's going to be joining us for more going forward as well. So possibly monthly if we can get him to come on, but we'll see how it works. So I'll talk about the topic today. The topic we're going to be covering is the fall of the Mezzers. Now I've done an episode on the fall of the Mezzers with Fist and Jawa, Fist 25 and Jawa Sparky. And we kind of covered like the sort of the end-ish of that time period. But we wanted to do one a little bit more detailed about it's the fall of the Mezzers, but it's more about the rise and fall of the Mezzers. How did the Mezzers get to the point where they did fall? Why did they fall? We'll probably talk a little bit about the rise of Ivar and the beginnings of the UEE at some point, but this kind of captured our imagination because there's a lot of lore that recently came out about things like the fall, the siege of Tiber, the Bremen Beltway, and a bunch of other things about the kind of the end of the Mezzer era, which are kind of fascinating. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it over to Jale. Go ahead. Why don't you start us off with some context on who the Mezzers are?
Yes, I thought it would be interesting to contextualize the fall of the last couple of Messer emperors in terms of those who came before. The reason it's interesting is because leaders who have the ability to forge an empire's rise to power, they rarely have much in common with their successors under whose tenure the empire collapses. This is true of the Messer Empire. Ivar the First was a military and political wunderkind who united an interplanetary empire at the age of 30, while his successor, Linton Messer XI, by all accounts, was a greedy and ineffectual leader who was rejected by essentially everyone from the highest parts of imperial society to the very bottom person on the street. So I've thought it'd be interesting to look into where it all went wrong for the Messers. Was Linton XI a rare gap in the armour of a proud and strong family, or was he the tail end of a dynasty in decline? So a couple of quick notes. Firstly, the Messers used an unusual system of regnal numbering. Linton the 11th wasn't the 11th Linton to take the throne, but rather just the 11th Messer to bear the title. And secondly, this segment, I'm going to be talking in terms of these good. If I say someone is good at something, I don't really mean they're effective. I'm not saying that crushing your opponents and suppressing the population is a morally good thing. This is about how effective they were rather than trying to make apologies for them.
I'm going to insert real quickly for those who don't know. We often use the same terminology when we're referring to leaders or emperors. Like the Roman empires are often referred to as the good emperors, and that doesn't necessarily mean they were good. It just means that they were effective. So this is
they kept the government functioning and held the empire together.
Exactly.
And didn't let it crumble into nothingness.
So we're using historical and like and academic terms of good. So just keep that in mind.
So just for people like me here, that means that like child labor isn't good.
Yes, child labor and wanton, almost near slavery is probably a bad thing.
So
Okay, good.
Good for profits, bad for morals. So, okie dokie. With that little light bit over, let's dive into it. So the first three messes were undoubtedly very effective at building and retaining power. Ivar the First transformed the newly minted UPE into the UEE in very short order, building the organs of power that would allow his descendants to rule for over 200 years. His successor, Deacon II, was no less brutal than his father and crushed the Tavarin again during the Second Tavarin War, as well as expanding military and judicial powers. But he also funded exploration, terraforming, and oversaw reforms of progressive taxation, so he built a stronger and more sustainable empire before abdicating and acting as an advisor to his daughter, Livia III. So while these first two messes were military strongmen who could rely on the Tavaran Wars for a sort of rally round the flag loyalty, under Livia's reign, we start to see some of the more insidious organs of the empire developing: propaganda, political repression, and political prisons, which Al's going to talk about later. There's a really notable example of how Livia operated. In 2638, the governor of Terra, who was a man called Asan Kiran, attempted to propose that Terra and other surrounding worlds around the Xi'an borderlands, they would try and secede from the empire. Rather than crush that threat with force, Livia broke that challenge apart by saying, let's have a referendum about it, and then snowing it with propaganda, probably even fixing the vote, and getting the result that she wanted, which was a rejection of that proposal. But within 6 months, Kieran's personal reputation was also destroyed by a series of lurid allegations, and by the end of the year, he and all of his supporters had been basically painted in the press as Xi'an terrorists. So it was very much the case of her father and her grandfather fought wars with guns, but Livia would destroy people without firing a shot. End of Livia III's reign is probably where you start to see some of the first cracks appearing, though, because she was flying back to Moscow with her family, and her husband and son died when the shuttle went down. Within 2 years, she would eventually abdicate due to grief, and she actually named her dead son as the fourth emperor. So he never actually reigned, but Marius IV was officially the fourth emperor. So the throne then went to her brother Corson V, who was probably also the prime suspect in assassinating the last couple of people. And that was the first time that a Messer would rise to power over the corpse of their predecessors, but not the last. So Corson extended the political and judicial repression that his predecessor brought in, widened capital punishment, removed the right for a trial on political crimes, and he wasn't effective in other ways. He tried to nationalize terraforming, but that caused the collapse of the Gold Horizon stations, which is where we end up with pirate havens like Pyro. Like, they only had an empty station to move into because of Corson. And much like Marius IV, he would also reach a sticky end, and his heir apparent, Gammon Messer, they were assassinated by poison. And that was very fortunate for Ileana VI, who probably ordered those poisonings. She was the last of the Messers to attempt to actually give more freedom back to people, though. So she attempted to loosen some of that repression, diminished some of the propaganda, allowed for a greater freedom of the press. So she was what we probably would say is one of the nicer Messers in the middle. But towards the end of her 35-year reign, she named her youngest son Samuel as her successor. But when she died, her niece Astrid seized power as Astrid VII. Ashra led 4 years of civil war, redirecting a lot of the Empire's resources towards her personal hunt for Samuel, who'd gone into hiding. But eventually, his assassins were better than her assassins, and Samuel took the throne as Samuel VIII. He was also brutal, and he used the military to suppress the citizenry. And as we'll hear in a bit, the military probably had some better things to be doing than just that. And he was stabbed to death in his bed. He was stabbed to death in his bed, giving way to his brother Gale IX. So let's just quickly recap that little segment. All that assassination and subterfuge. That means between 2697 with Ileana and 2715 with Gala, there were 4 emperors. Every single one of them had either assassinated their way to power, been assassinated, or done both. The rest of Gale IX's reign seems to recall the Arthurian tale of the Fisher King. He suffered a degenerative bone illness, and other than the murder of his predecessor, his most notable achievement is he changed the name of the currency to imperials, and he had some architectural style, which aren't great accomplishments in 36 years. He had no children, named his nephew Ulysses as his successor, the 10th emperor, and that's basically where I want to take things. So, because Paul is going to talk about how Ulysses the 10th and Linton the 11th led to the final downfall of the Messers, but I hope you can see that it wasn't simply a moment of weakness for the dynasty, but rather a slow decline that plagued the Messers. First few imperatives were able to lead by example, by cunning, and direct the resources of humanity towards creating a strong state. But by the midpoint, they'd already started to fall into like infighting, warfare, and increasingly just use the powers to enrich and strengthen themselves without creating the real power base that would allow them to come to power in the first place. Okay, that's that segment. So, Space, if you repose that question, we'll cut this bit out, and then I'll be like, "That's a great question."
You want me to say it now?
Yeah.
Okay, so what's kind of the backdrop for this whole period of time in these? I think you said it's about 2600 or so to 2700.
So this is the period from I can't even remember the dates now. We're talking the early 2600s. I think was when Ivor the Messer took power, late 2500s, up until the 2700s is when the UAE went democratic again.
Okay,
as democratic as it is.
Okay.
So yeah,
it's a span of about a little over 200 years, I think is what it is, because I believe it's 2545 was when the end of the First Varan War happened, and it took about 10 years or so for Ivar to become imperator, and he didn't really finalize a lot of his stuff until about the end of the 26th century, and then his sons. So we've got about 3 imperators from Ivor to Messer III, which is towards the end of the 27th century, so 2600s, and then we have that time period between 2690 and 2705, I want to say, or 2715, where where they're just stabbing each other to death. So over the course of
and that's what I'm wondering is this. It sounds like, a bunch of obviously assassinations, and like you said, somebody ran out of the throne, and there was a civil war in the background. Was the rest of the UEE or just humanity just sort of watching this? Was there other big things going on at the time?
Well, this is the entire span of the history, and we'll in that period, it is really you hear about how. I mean, this was the distraction essentially. What other things are happening in the background is they have this essentially what I would argue is almost an artificial Cold War with the Xi'an, so nothing's really happening there. I think it's interesting to note that a lot of this period is a period of stagnation. Most of the borders of what we think of as the UAE had already been discovered at this point, and there was a real slowdown in the discovery of any new systems, which is in part perhaps to do with lack of exploration. Also, in part, we were starting to come up against, there's the Xi'an to that side. We can't go any further that way.
There's the Vandal this way. We can't go further that way.
Yeah,
precisely.
Anu that side. So you're kind of getting to that. We're running into the other races, and now have to stop expanding outwards.
And I'll talk about this at some point as well, but it's important to remember that in that time period, Samuel Meser, at the very beginning of the 2700s, is when we first run into the Van Duel. So the kind of the background for this whole situation is humanity at the very beginning had won 2 wars back to back against the Devarin. Weren't easy, but they won, and they managed to kind of build this momentum. But by the time you're getting like 100 years after the Second Devarin War, you're seeing like the mechanisms are slowing down. People are becoming more repressed. People are becoming less likely to speak out. And people who do speak out often just disappear, as Al will talk about. So, I think it's a good way of putting it is that like it's really important to remember that the first 3 Mezers probably earnestly believed that they were doing the right thing. They at least they believed they were doing the right thing for humanity. I wouldn't argue that the last couple of Mezers were in it for anything other than power and self, and money, the keeping themselves in power. Mm-hmm. So, you at least have some, dictator's going to dictator, horrible fascist regimes are going to be horrible fascist regimes, whether they believe in it or not. It's just so happens that the Mezers, the early Mezers had a little bit more of a wherewithal about who they were and the kind of situation they were in, whereas the later ones just kind of forgot that they were not exactly popular.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to note the ways that although the first 3 were all brutal in their own way, they were also investing in the future. And really the only other one that did that was Ilyana, with trying to like loosen some of the grip, because they understood that it wasn't just a sort of divine right to rule situation, which kind of is that attitude which led you into like real world revolutions like the French Revolution. It's like, I am the state. I'm not ordained by God, therefore everything I do is fantastic. That kind of delusion, I think you really see in how they've sort of written these characters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I think you certainly see the good emperors, or the good imperators, being the first 3, Liliana. I'd probably even say, as horrible and evil as I think she is, Livia is probably another good emperor because of the way she deals with the opposition. She doesn't necessarily do it by bang, bang, you're dead. She uses other means to ensure that they're silenced or removed or taken care of. And that comes, interestingly, in her role of helping people disappear, as I'll get to shortly.
Well, we'll get into that. It's a good transition. Al, tell us about the Empire's Light Reformation Centers, or whatever they're called.
Yep. Well, we're really looking at the decline and fall, I think, of the Meser regime. And it's interesting because I think we see the ripple effects of those tumultuous years of the Mesers still being felt in the UAE today. These ripples at times are barely noticeable, and at other times you can't avoid coming across them. And that's the case with Charon 3. Charon 3 rejected their recognition by the UAE. They are the only planet to ever do so. And at the moment, Charon 3 is gripped in a civil war, which I think is a direct result of those Meser years. So why is Charon 3, or Horus, as it was called before they left the UAE, it being talked about in terms of the decline and fall of the Meser regime? The Charon system was discovered in 2538. Charon 3 was the only planet suitable for terraforming within the Green Zone, and it was terraformed and settled. For the first 90 years, Charon 3 had only developed into a sparsely populated agrarian and rural world. That all changed in 2628 with the ascension of Livia Meza. She proposed to the Senate the building of a special maximum security prisons administered by and under the direct jurisdiction of the Imperator on Horus, or Charon 3. Over the next 254 years, Charon 3 would rise economically, being carried and elevated in fortune by the misfortunes of the Mezer's political prisoners, or undesirables of the empire. And so this system plays a part in the fall and decline. Or so did this system play a role in the fall and decline of the mezzas? The establishment of the prisons certainly saw the population boom within Sharon, with staff to run the prisons, shops to supply them, building the infrastructure that went with the prisons. And it also saw the introduction of factories on the prisons, factories on the planet where the prisoners were being forced to work. The prisons were first established in the state of Delaware, one of the two states in Sharon 2 and one of the two states that are leading or gripped in that civil war. Now, when Coulson Meza ascended the throne in 2643, Delaware had already changed from being a rural backwater into an urbanized centre of commerce. That just gives an idea of how much this planet benefited from the Mezzas grants and the commerce that was being generated by these prisons. So many political prisoners or opponents had been put into prison that Coulson expanded the prison system into the neighbouring state of Acheron, which is also the other state that's gripped in this civil war. And he was the one who changed the name of these prisons to the Empire Light Conversion Centres. This is where dissenters of the Empire could be re-educated. These so-called criminals, and I use that term, were often deserters from the military, political dissidents, Xi'an sympathisers, protesters, violent agitators, and you can understand those people being locked away for various reasons. But it also included members of the press, social organisers, and politicians. Many of the prisoners died, having merely died while in captivity and having disappeared from their former lives. So they literally just disappeared. We get an idea of this from the seminal work, the Bremen Beltway, which records many eyewitness accounts, and none is as poignant as the comments by August Dunlow, the founder of Crusader Industries, who, for instance, when talking about missing friends, said they just disappeared, and people assumed the Mezzas got them. Dunlow goes on to explain that it was the fear of these prisons that helped him decide to flee the empire. In his own words, anything was better than one of the Mezzas re-education prisons. The very existence of the ULCC, or the Empire Light Correctional Centres, caused many disaffected political opponents to the Mezzas to actually flee the empire. Evidence seized upon by the fall of a regime indicate the conditions in the prisons could easily be likened to the Russian gulags under Stalin, the Nazi Germany's concentration camps for political dissidents or undesirables, or even the Japanese work camps positioned along the Burma Railway in World War II. So these prisons were in no way pleasant places to be, and significant members of the food and supplies and medical were there really just to ensure people could survive. Samuel Meza VIII, when he comes to power, he actually works at doing he does several things. One, he makes it, puts in a program where old prisoners are killed off to make room for new prisoners. There's so many coming into the system. But he also authorized the military to practice or test chemical weapons on them. And so great was the leaching of chemicals from the mass graves of these prisoners that protests on Sharon actually broke out. These were brutally put down by the Mezzas, and yet in the decades following this, protests continued with increasing regularity on Sharon 3. And this tended to start to show the weakness of the Mezzas. They even on their key home prison system, they were still having people protest and go against them. Now, following the news of Linton Mezza's death in 2792, the populace of Sharon literally stormed the Bastille, liberating the prisoners, freeing up a whole host of revolutionary leaders and people who had been galvanized by their prison sentence against the Mezzas. The planet rejected its recognition by and seat in the Senate, and even refused to rejoin the UEE after the Mezzas had finally and permanently been ousted from power. Therefore, in my opinion, there can be no doubt that the Empire Light Correctional Centres, or Conversion Centres, really aided in the decline of the Mezzas in two significant ways. First, because of their existence, many future leaders who risked fleeing rather than being incarcerated in them. And second, the protests on Sharon 3 in the decades prior to the death of Linton Mezza and the storming of the Bastille upon his news of his death freed many of the intellectuals and the evidence, and provided the evidence that would prevent the Mezza's return. As I said at the beginning, sadly, we still see the ripples of the Mezzas in that system. No longer recipients of funding from the Empire. For the prisons, Sharon Free has gone into economic decline, and a result of civil war now exists between the states of Acheron and Delon. And that's the end of that paper.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to like really argue any of that.
Yeah, that was not great.
Yeah.
Can I confess something? Until this conversation here, I had not been understanding it as Empire's Light correctional facilities in the sense of light of the Empire. I'd always assumed it in the sense of like they're just trying to make it sound a little bit like it's not like they're heavy correction.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just another
Medium
light
heavy
correction.
centers.
You know,
This wasn't light correction. This was
serious correction.
You're going to agree with us or disappear permanently, and now you're here. Like, people would go in them. You didn't need to get arrested. You didn't need to have a trial. You could just being arrested on suspicion was enough to end you, to put you in Orville, the biggest correctional centre, and await trial.
Yeah.
And you would often die awaiting trial.
Well, you wouldn't even have
long.
you wouldn't even be like arrested. A lot of people just ended up there because they were political dissidents. Like, you just be black bagged, and then suddenly you're in this place.
Well,
that
is arrest. That is the arrest. The
the
boys in black turn up, put a hood over your head, you're arrested, you're gone. No trial, no reason.
But it wasn't like a uniformed officer knocks on your door. It's like this two dudes in a suit walk up to your door, kick it in, throw a bag over your head, and drag you into a waiting, ship, and then you're gone. And like, no one knows what happened, but everyone knows what happened because, that's kind of thing that happens.
There's an interesting irony in that these were set up by Livia, who, as we were discussing, was one of the most savvy people on this. So you have to imagine she was using them with a degree of subtlety. But then the downfall was that you had people like Samuel who had no idea of the subtlety and was just using this on everyone. And that was why it was turned bad. Though, interestingly, one of the people I mentioned, Gammon Messer, who was the heir apparent to Coulson, he got assassinated, right? He was obsessed with these prisons, and he would go in and he basically learned torture for fun. And he got assassinated before he became emperor, though. So we were probably spared an even worse emperor who probably loved them even more by that assassination, which is kind of a interesting little twist.
You mean he would have probably done more things that are even worse than Samuel did? Hey, military, just test these chemical weapons on these guys. They're the old got prisoners. They're no longer productive in our factories.
Yeah.
Well, the comment on Galactopedia is that Gammon was credited with creating more intense prisoner conditions and devising particularly violent forms of information extraction, many from which he learned accompanying Coulson on his visits to these places. So, we were spared Gammon Messer in a sense.
And the other thing that happens is as conditions in the Empire get tight, and I do realise I miss this, is that funding for the prisons actually started to dry up. So what they did is they reduced the food allocations and the medical supplies, but increased the workload. And so it was just concentration camps in Germany. You work your prisoners to death, and they were working on military projects. They were working in military factories and other areas. So the prisons, while they may have originally been just to keep the unlikely I suppose you could liken them to the original, the start of the concentration camps in Germany, where the political prisoners or the intellectuals who opposed Nazism, or the undesirables like the gypsies or homosexuals or mentally
People the party didn't like.
Yeah.
people the party didn't like were put there, and they were just out of sight, out of mind. But as time went on, they were put to work, working in the factories and other things. And by the end of the war, they were treated no differently than how we see Holocaust Jews were treated.
We've got a really light-hearted episode today, haven't we?
Yeah.
Definitely.
This is a good first one for me.
Oh,
I mean, we haven't even started talking about Anthony Tanaka or anything like that.
Oh my God!
We're gonna end child murder. This is going to be fall.
Now, interestingly,
should have been our Halloween episode.
I was reading on Anthony Tanaka. Now, yes, he is killed by an advocacy agent for his defiance.
Uh-huh.
We'll get to
Anthony Tanaka is an absolute little snot.
All right.
He's
All right.
one of his
Happy Luminalia, everyone.
Let me get into it. I'll get into it at some point, just because it's important. I think it's important to understand the context of like the 18-hour shifts that little guy would do at 11.
Paul told me this was going to be a happy podcast. I was told this was going to be a good Tuesday.
I lied to you. All right.
History's fun, but it's never good.
Let's move on to the next your next section, which is actually I think it's one that many people may not even know, even if they follow the lore pretty closely, which is like kind of the role of Bremen and other sorts of the kingmakers, as you will, of the Mezzers. Al, why don't you give us a little bit about that?
In history, we find there are many factors that often contribute to these key events or key periods of time. And this series of lectures we're really looking at is looking at the influences that, or those forces which influence the decline and fall of the Mezzer regime. And this will soon be available to you all if you go to the Hurston company store on Lawville, under the title of The Fall and Decline of the Mezzer Regime.
Make it happen, CIG. Make it happen.
So, the Bremen Defence Force. Kingmakers? In ancient times, the Kingmaker was first applied to Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, during the War of Roses in England, because of the influence he had. He was literally able to overthrow the king, appoint a successor, and then have that king restored to power because he didn't like what was going on. That is a real kingmaker. Now, surely the BDF or the Bremen Defence Force couldn't be kingmakers, could they? After all, they were merely the semi-private, publicly owned militia force of Bremen that has maintained the security of Bremen for 3.5 centuries. How could or did this organisation play a part in the decline and fall of the Mezzer regime? There are several reasons. First, the very existence of the BDF and its creation during the Second Tevaran War highlighted the inability of the advocacy or military under the Mezzers to provide or guarantee a system's security. So we see cracks appearing, we see that weakness. Even a system like Bremen that was far from the front lines. Pirate raids would lead Philip Lattimore to meet with one of Bremen's largest landowners and de facto governor, Articus Corner. Now, outside of Bremen, few people probably recognise or know who Articus was, but everyone knows the family through Consolidated Outland and Silas Corner. Now, when Lattimore went to Articus and laid out his games, Articus basically said, "How much money do you need to set this up?" And as a result, the BDF was formed very quickly after that. Now, in those years, the BDF was funded by the Corner family. The presence of the BDF kept the system secure, keeping the advocacy's travel safety advisory systems warnings or threat level warnings for Bremen as low. And although you'll rarely hear of the MES's inability to ensure the security of the Bremen system, it was really the BDF rather than the MESs that ensured the safety of countless travellers into that system during those years. Second, the success of the BDF in being able to consistently maintain system security meant that the measure regime didn't insist on greater centralised control. After all, why insist on changing something when the existing system is working in your favour? Yet, it is the fact that the BDF was not controlled by the MESs that enabled it to play a significant part in the establishment of, and dare I say, the running of, the Bremen Beltway. This is not to say the MESs didn't attempt to insert agents into the militia. However, the militia's leadership instructed all volunteers not to discuss empire-wide politics while on duty, and whether the leadership was aware of those suspected, or whether the leadership was aware of or merely suspected that the MESs had agents operating within the militia, the members were consistently paired up at random, and they also changed their name or changed their motto to Bremen above all. So they really tried to, or really kept themselves outside of the political discussion early on, or at least at the forefront. They encouraged the volunteers not to talk empire-wide, so they gave them as no grounds on which to change the current situation. And it was this autonomy that the BDF maintained that ensured they were able to work in other means to bring about the downfall of the MES regime. And I think the fact that the MESs didn't control the BDF also shows that weakness and in their control as well. Now, as the MESs devolved into despotic rulers, and as the public opinion shifted under the burdensome yoke of their control, the autonomy of the BDF enabled the leadership to assist in, organise and orchestrate the smuggling of dissidents seeking to flee the empire and avoid detention in one of the feared MES's conversion centres. It is such a fear that caused August Dunlow, the future founder of Crusader Industries, to actually choose to flee the empire. Bremen became the first stop on their trip out of empire, and that path was later named the Bremen Beltway. These actions by the BDF ensured that many future leaders of revolution escaped the MESs, and it was solely because of the Bremen Defence Force that they were often able to avoid patrols and get safely away. Now, August Dunlow is a significant case here, because when he returns, he actually first enters politics. He doesn't start up Crusader straight away. He actually enters politics in a goal to change the empire, and he only moves into industry when he realizes, I can do more when I'm working in industry rather than working in politics itself. When the conditions were ripe for revolution, those individuals who'd been smuggled out along the Beltway were then also smuggled back. Bremen was that safe gateway back into empire, and this again highlights the role of the BDF in the decline and the fall of the MES regime. Now, we still see the ripples of the Bremen Defence Force during this period today. The BDF became the blueprint for the Civilian Defence Force, the force that was activated to repel the Xeno threat invasion of Stanton. Not many people have realised that the headquarters of the CDF is not on Earth or Terra, as many would expect, but it's on Bremen. And so it is significant. So significant is the role of the BDF that when RSI was developing the Polaris for use by in the militia mobilization scheme, that they consult with both the BDF and the UEN to work out the specifics and what the ship would require. And the BDF were among the first to place orders for the Polaris. Now, many have also postulated that there will be an eventual conflict between Sol and Terra. But it seems that whoever Bremen and the BDF support will be the one to come out on top as king. And I think in the final analysis, Bremen and the BDF may yet be the last best choice for the maintenance of a stable UEE. That, however, is going to be a discussion for a later date. And that's the end of our second paper.
Nice. Yeah, it's hard to understate Bremen, because Bremen is the reason why the First Varn War succeeded. Bremen fed the Empire during the height of the First Varn War, while all these other places were going down. Bremen was just an agricultural world, so it just fed everywhere. It's where Big Benny's comes from. It's from Bremen. So
controlled by Terra Mills. That is the point which in the last Star Citizen Live, one of our law masters aired in. He said that he was talking about Big Benny's, and he said, "Oh, it's just a fast food stall type of, the convenience machines." But it's actually owned by Terra Mills, the biggest food manufacturing company in the Empire. They own, you name it, they probably own it.
Pips and Big Benny's are the two big ones, but yeah, a lot of the stuff you can find now are owned by Terra Mills, which is really Bremen Mills is actually what it is. So
and they just changed it too.
Yeah, well, it was Bremen. It was Bremen Mills, and then a giant explosion nearly destroyed like all of their crops, and Terra stepped in. A Terra firm stepped in and said, "We'll buy you out." So essentially, Terra Mills, which was founded in Terra, is headquartered out of Bremen. So,
I had a question. When you were talking about the Bremen Beltway, and you were saying how people were being smuggled into and out of the Empire, where were they staying? Were there any specific systems people were centralizing outside of the Empire?
Yeah, they actually mostly ended up in it's a Kurilla on the world of Shi in the Xi'an Empire, which, despite its name, is not actually like that important a world to them per se. I think it's in the Relar system. Yeah, and there's still this significant expat community there. It's like Kurilla is to the UEE what London was to the Russian Empire, where all these people who were trying to flee the new the repression ended up in London, and so you got this community still there of humans in Kurilla. But they would go from Bremen, you'd go to Levski, and you'd eventually end up on what's the world where they the floating worlds,
Tohill,
Tohill.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's where you'd swap over to sort of Xi'an smugglers, who then smuggle you through to Relar eventually.
I see. Yeah, I'm looking at the map here. I see how that works out.
And Levski were keen to be to actually take any of the refugees and build up their own position. But when people were looking at Levski was still in such a state of disrepair that they couldn't support the numbers of people that were coming through. And so they would often opt to go through and continue on their way up to the Xeon safe world or territories. And the Xeon would interview them and enable them to get feeds of information from what was happening back at home. And they would use that information to work out exactly what they should be doing. Kind of very well fits into that war by other means approach. But I still think the Xeon really approached the Cold War in a totally different way that the UEE dealt with it. They dealt with it more by manipulation or bending the things rather than military force.
Yeah,
they still have that ability.
I looked into doing a segment about how aliens were involved in the downfall of the messes, and is really notable for the lack, essentially, the lack of stuff where that's been written. The Barney weren't involved. The Tavaran don't seem to have been any part of the fall of the Messers. Hence, they weren't really part of the new empire afterwards until much, much later, as in integrated into society more by it. And obviously, the Vandal have their role in being invaders. The only thing where you can really say, that's where some aliens were involved in this, is that the Xi'an Empire reversed the Beltway, smuggle people back in, and those were the people who were leading some of this later, just like Lenin returning from Austria.
But they were also doing that at times where it was suitable to send someone back. It seemed that they were doing it not only at the end, where they kind of had everyone go, but they also did it at times when, yes, you'd be good to go back now. Yes, you'd be good. And so.
And it seems like Levski was playing a pretty big role in that. Is Levski in lore? Is it something that is perceived to be a little bit more big and bustling compared to what we've seen in games so far, which obviously isn't final, but just because I hear Levski referred to, but then when I think of it in my own mind eye, I'm like, this was just like a small outpost.
It is an outpost, but it is bigger than you think. If you remember Levski and like the Cafe Moussine and the Grand Barter and all those places, you'll notice that it's all very ad hoc, because essentially it was a mining facility that was taken over, abandoned, and then a bunch of revolutionaries took it over, and they've had to essentially mine their way into the asteroid or into the planetoid to kind of expand their reach. But it was never designed to hold the amount of people it has. So it's sort of like partially a settled kind of outpost, but it's also sort of the capital of Nyx because of it has the most developed, infrastructure compared to everybody else. But they also aren't. They're big, but they're more big in the fact that they have the political.
Their reputation is big.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree that they're sort of significant without being very populous. And and a lot of people think of The Expanse. It's not like series. It's not supposed to be like the sort of big sort of actual city. It's very much more like one of these smaller stations in that work of fiction, where there's probably only a few hundred to maybe a few thousand people actually there, and they're just sort of
Ganymede.
Behind the scenes. Yeah, exactly, like Ganymede, and then. It's just that they're really significant, and a lot of people who are flying about doing things outside the UEE call it home port.
Okay,
but it's not just that. Also, it's not just that Levski is the only place in that asteroid belt. There are lots of small settlements scattered throughout that asteroid belt,
and on the planets.
And Levski is like the home base, the place where they'd get their main supplies. So you've got this lots of small bases throughout that asteroid belt in the Levski system, in the Nyx system, and Levski is like the capital, even though it's a kind of like Ganymede.
Yeah, they're very much like if you're using Expanse as a reference, they're very much like the political arm of the OPA. In that sense, where like people like Anderson Dawes and I'm forgetting his name, the people who are like the political leaders, the ones who go and talk. Anderson, yeah, they're the political side of things. Whereas you have people like Pyro and places like you have places like Pyro, and you have places like Spider, Cathcart, which are more of like the violent military wing of outlaws and pirates.
Your Marcos.
Yeah, your Marcos. Yeah, Pyro is your Marco Naros. Your Free Navy. That's definitely if Xenothreat managed to organize those groups together in Pyro, then yeah, that would be the dangerous thing. So they're unified in cause, but they're not really unified in political ways. In fact, Nyx is key to keep pirates out of it entirely. That's the people's Alliance of Levski actively hunt pirates in their system because pirates attract attention of the UEE, because Nyx sits on the border of Cascom, of Castra, thank you. And so on the border of Castra, which was at one point a former UAE military base. So it was like, yeah, let's not kick the hornet's nest and give them an excuse to come in.
Yeah.
And that's one of the problems they've got at the moment is they are under threat from pirates who are moving in and trying to exert control over the area as well. If you're someone who does like that idea of being a belter, then Nyx is the system for you.
Yeah.
Because basically the main part of Nyx is that asteroid belt with Levski as your kind of your capital.
I was just quickly Googling some real world history to give also some context to it. Nassau, the capital of the pirate republic in the Caribbean at its height, had about 1,000 pirates and a couple of hundred other residents. And that was enough for us to have massively disrupted everything around, because the significance doesn't always need to be a big population, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's more of its logistical reality. It's like, when you're out in the black and you're pirating, you can't really stop off at, Lorville and get yourself some fresh food and supplies. So you got to find a place where you can repair, rearm, and places where legitimate traders would show up. And Levski's just happens to be outside of the UAE control and right near a lot of borders with the UAE where it can get legitimate traders to show up and trade to them with goods. So that's why
our barkeep knows the old man Al Hurston just doesn't like those revolutionaries hanging around and disrupting things on
Hurston. All right.
He's quite happy for him to do it on ArcCorp, but
I guess it leaves me. We're going to talk a little bit about the full fall of the Mezzers. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Space Tomato. That the like this lore does start to dovetail into what we know in Star Citizen pretty closely, and the areas around. Stanton wasn't discovered until after the fall of the Mezzers, but a lot of the systems that are around that region were discovered before the fall of the Mezzers. So they all often, like Pyro and Nyx and Castra and Magnus are all very steeped in this history of, what came before it. So with all of this context, let me tell you about how the Mezzers fell. So the first thing that we're going to have to do is go back and look at Samuel Mezzer. Now, Samuel Mezzer was ruthless, and he also refused to deal with the Vanduul threat. Orion was the first area of the Vanduul invasions. It started with just a light amount of raiding. Eventually, you have some private militias, and the UAE sends a fleet out to try to defend the system initially. And it works fairly well. But as Samuel becomes so focused on his own power acquisition, remember this is just after a civil war, where him and his relatives have been going at it trying to figure out who is going to be in power, there is a lot of infighting and other problems. So the Navy fleet that was sent to secure Orion started to get bleed off its forces as years went on, and Samuel refused to reinforce it. In fact, pulling the main carrier that anchored the fleet off to go deal with an uprising somewhere else in the Empire. And right when that happened, the Vanduul finally struck in force, and including a kingship, which caused the entire collapse and rout of UAE forces from Orion. After the fall of Orion, thankfully, the Vanduul did not chase the UAE away. They simply stayed in Orion and continued to harvest the system for resources. But Samuel wanted to try to erase history, so he ordered the ICC Stellar Surveyors to erase the civilian records that Orion ever existed. And so the ICC Stellar Surveyors said no, which was a rare thing to do in the Mezzers, because that usually meant you're about to die or about to sent to a rehabilitation center somewhere in the Empire. When
I can tell you where that was. That was probably Sharon 3.
Yeah. But when Samuel ordered the military to storm the ICC Stellar Surveyors headquarters and arrest everybody, they refused and turned on Samuel and stabbed him to death in his bed. So
that's definitely not how you want to get turned down.
No. So he's dead, and the system still, we still have the measure systems. They're trying to figure out who to replace Samuel with. So Gaylor was Sam's very sick. He was kind of, for his whole life, he'd been very sick. Older brother who was passed over for Samuel. And when Sam was murdered, Gaylor was put into power to try to kind of prop up in 2715. And Gaylor took the threat much more seriously. In fact, in Tohill, which at that point was still sort of lightly patrolled by the UEE, because of its relation to the Xi'an Empire along the Peri line, Gaylor was the one who finally ordered all of the UEE presence to be pulled out of Tohill and back into Castra as a way of trying to mitigate how overstretched the UE had been becoming, and also to help reallocate forces to the Vandal front. This opened up the Bremen Beltway in the first place, allowing for smugglers and other entrepreneurs to make their way to Tohill and start setting up bases. It's where where Xi'an smugglers and human smugglers first met one another, and Tohill 3 became this kind of paradise mecca of outlaw kind of mixing. It's this weird kind of place where you had the elites of UEE society mixing with the absolute poorest and like outlaw rebel smugglers, with Xi'an coming by, and it's this weird kind of.
It's where you even get the meeting of the Terran senator and Xi'an representatives that brokered the peace.
It is the place where we see the that whole piece happen in the first place. But that would go ahead.
Before the UE was in Tohill, was the Xi'an there, or was it just unclaimed?
It was unclaimed. No one was there. There's the thing about Tohill 3 is that Tohill 3 is empty. Tohill 3 is a water world. The only thing that you can actually set up bases on are these floating flower beds, literally floating flower beds, which they were kind of like flower icebergs floating on this ocean, and that's where they'd set up a lot of their living.
Romantic.
Yeah, it's beautiful, a beautiful place until they sink. And when you put too many things on them, they sink, and that it actually did happen once. So Gaylor kind of unintentionally opens up the Bremen Beltway and desperately tries to reinforce the forces along the Vandal front. And when we have the Siege of Tibur. Now, the Siege of Tibur lasts 4 years, and it is a meat grinder. It is where forces go in. The Navy had secured its INS station, Imperial Naval Station, in the system, and had all of its forces stuck on that station because the Admiral was hoping for a diplomatic solution with the Vandal. I know that sounds insane, but this is only a couple of years after they'd first met the Vandal. So he was holding out for being able to talk with the Vandal because he didn't want to go to all-out war, because he knew that an all-out war would require all-out effort. And it took up until the last minute when he finally decided he had to engage the Vandal, and basically had ceded much of the system to the Vandal by that point, and was able to push back and retake Tibur 2, using surgical strikes of likely antimatter warheads to deny land for the to the Vandal and flush them out of settlements which they had captured from humans. Essentially scorched earth, burning the places before they could use it to rebuild their forces. Which is, I think, one of the first recorded uses of antimatter warheads in the UE that we know of in history, because of just a sheer destruction. And it worked. They almost were able to push the Vandal out of Tibur with this counterattack, until an unknown jump point opened up, and another clan fled, flooded out of this unknown jump point into Tiber.
That's not even fair.
Yeah.
It's like cheating.
When is history fair? When is history fair?
It's important to also note that the Vanduul are not like a mono. They're not like the Grand Vanduul Alliance or whatever. They're all little clans. They're individual clans that are working. So Tiber proved that as you go to war with a Vanduul, it will attract other clans to come fight you as well, because they're all looking for glory through combat. So the theory in the lore, at least, is that this 4 years of conflict finally encouraged Vanduul to come to Tiber through this jump point and kind of get in on the action, get in on on all this blood making. So
then Vanduul are basically just PvPers.
Yes.
Somebody hops in and says, "I'll fight," and everybody's yes.
Yes.
Yeah. And then when the fight's over with that guy, they will often fight among themselves because
Yeah, because
exactly.
They want the resources.
Get bored. Yeah.
So this crushes the UEE fleet. The admiral charges in to try to stop them, and his entire task force is wiped out, causing a fall back to Virgil. And unlike the Orion system fall, Virgil, when Tiber fell, Virgil, the Vanduul just went straight after them, and invaded Virgil. Straight through, following the UEE right behind them. And if it wasn't for the sacrifice of most of Squadron 214, also known as the Black Crows, who stood their ground to try to give the time for civilians to evacuate Virgil, there would have probably been an even worse catastrophe in Virgil, other than the 4 years of conflict. But shortly after that, Virgil falls. 214 is nearly annihilated. Basically, an entire fleet is destroyed in this conflict, which is billions of credits, countless numbers of lives. It's an absolute disaster, and the military's morale is on the floor after this conflict. After 5 years of war, everything is lost. The why were we fighting in the first place kind of concept. So. This ended with Gaylor succumbing to his lifelong sickness in 2751, but he had been kind of failing in health before that, and so his nephew, who was the High Secretary at the time, essentially the Prime Minister, versus the king, as it were, Ulysses took over. Slowly took over and eventually kind of became the imperator himself. And the problem with Ulysses was very much, from a very young age, was more interested in internal politics. He wanted to try to secure the UEE. He was obsessed with grand design. He wanted big projects, and he had been obsessed specifically about a specific coliseum, a stadium that he was building in Angeli, as a way of saying, because he thought that if you built these grand things, it would appease the masses. So he had all of these ideas of kind of meddling with the internals. He raised taxes, he stripped environmental protections, he deregulated markets, removed the minimum wage, eliminated the minimum age requirement to work, expanded police powers, and instituted direct control over many star systems, including Magnus, with his own hand-picked governors who would control the entire system, which is very different from where it was. So we see a ratcheting up of control by the Mezzers during this time period, which doesn't go over well. Especially
now Paul, I gotta intervene here, because I can't understand why you think Gale was such a bad guy. He seems like a great guy for Hurston.
Yeah. Says
right,
old man. Says old man Hurston. So this leads to the death of Anthony Tanaka. In the Magnus system, we have a young boy who, as far as we know, was working at a very young age, around 9 or 10 years old. He was already working in weapons facilities.
I was reading earlier. At 7 years old, he was actually working.
Yeah, at 7 years old, he was working in these weapon facilities to clean out air ducts. Essentially, they would use their small size. They'd crawl through a lot of these like exhaust ports, and then they would clean out the soot to try that would build up and then leave. And he'd been doing this for several years. Both his parents were missing or gone. He lived in effectively company housing, where they got, I think, 1 day of schooling, required schooling a year or a week. But under Gaylor or under Ulysses, they completely removed that. So they were working 24/7 essentially. Their shifts were 8 to 12 hours on average, and after a particularly long shift, I think it's up to 18-hour shift, he is leaving for the day, and his supervisor stops him and tells him that he has to take his colleague's shift because he was in was essentially in the hospital for anaphylactic shock. And this young boy, barely 12 years old, he just broke. He said no. And when the supervisor asked him again, he continued to shout, no, 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 stamp his feet, stubborn, staring at him, saying no, 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 and caused a huge ruckus with everyone stopping and looking at him. And casually, one of the guards strolled up, pulled out his sidearm, and shot the kid in the head. This was all recorded on footage. So, like I said, happy Liminalia, everybody!
Yay!
The fact of the matter was, I wouldn't say this is abnormal for the Mezzers. This is probably fairly typical for the time period. The thing that made it a little bit more sensationalist was that the guard wasn't just a guard. He was a member of the advocacy who was under direct control by a, what's his name? Lane Corpos, who was cousin to Ulysses. So this guard was essentially the hand-picked Secret Service member for Lane Corpos. So this would be as if a member of the Secret Service walked up to somebody on to a McDonald's, and while a kid was screaming at his manager he didn't want to go to work, pulled out a gun and shot him in the head in front of everybody, and someone caught it on footage. I'd say this became a empire-wide issue very quickly because this footage was shared all over Spectrum. It even caused RSI to completely rework its systems because this wasn't an RSI facility. This was a weapons maker. I can't remember exactly the name of the weapons maker offhand, but this we have the loss of Virgil and Tiber and Orion. We have the UE military's morale is on the floor. They're getting beat by the Vandal every single time they go up against them. And then on top of that, all of these harsh conditions are eroding away people's personal freedoms, and they're forced to be working long hours. And now on top of all of this, the federal police are murdering kids live on Spectrum. So this caused a bit of a hullabaloo, and a lot of people began to get very angry. This is when Ulysses decided he was going to shift tactics and started to build all of these great facilities to try to appease the masses, including Kanos Stadium on Angeli. Now, while this is going on, his children, Linton and Fiona Mezzer, were worried that their father was ruining the empire for them. Not because of all of the horrible things he was doing, but they were afraid that he was going to lose them their power. And he would basically spend all of the money and all the goodwill before they could get power. So they hatched a plot. Fiona, who, according to my records, this could also be wrong, was something like 14 years old at the time, was tasked with gathering anti-Mezzer radicals and gathering together and then training them to overthrow the government. with the help of the UEE military, who sent over Marines who were trained in asymmetrical warfare and stuff like that to train them. Essentially, what the United States does with the Green Berets, where they'll paratroop a couple of Green Berets behind enemy lines, and then they'll teach the locals how to fight and give them all these sorts of tactics and such like that. That's essentially what the UEE did under Fiona's guidance for these rebels, while her brother Linton managed to get the loyalty of the senators and the admiralty and the generals, all of the military and the political side, to join his side. Then secretly, in 2781, Ulysses was on Angeli in the Croshaw system for the grand opening of Kano Stadium. He drove through town, including passing one young Auguste Dunlop and his father and his mother, who were there out of school to say hi, to wave at the Imperator as he drove by. As he passed, shortly after he passed, an explosion ripped through the city as Fiona's rebels had destroyed Kano Stadium, had planted bombs and blew up Kano Stadium. And in the chaos, the military intercepted the transport of Ulysses, his vehicle, and surrounded them. And in a firefight, it was started between the military and his guards. Eventually, Ulysses realized that he was going to die, so he took his own life rather than be captured by the military. And in the process of cleaning up, both of Auguste Dunlop's parents were killed. Auguste was like 9 years old when this happened, making him an orphan. This would set Auguste Dunlop's life into a very political direction, as he was luckily picked up by a group called Angeli's Angels. As an orphan, he began to read. He ended up getting a degree in business. He managed to get like a scholarship and get a degree in business, and returned to Croshaw to lead and quickly became the head of the anti-Mezer political movement in the Croshaw system, the legal side, protesting and those sorts of things. And it's important to remember that Croshaw is the second system that humanity has ever been in, so it's a fairly politically and like important. It was very population heavy. It's one of the older systems of humanity. So Auguste Dunlop was maybe in his 20s when he was controlling a planet-wide a political activist movement. So he was targeted for assassination. Unfortunately, or fortunately for him, he came down with a flu and was forced to miss a transport that him and his friends were taking to Terra for a big anti-Mezer rally. Shortly after takeoff, that transport mysteriously exploded, which is when people started to realize that he was being targeted by the UEE, by the Mezers, for assassination, which has eventually led him to go down the Revolutionary Road, aka the Bremen Beltway, and to go into the Xi'an Empire as an exile. Of course, this is Auguste Dunlop, the future founder of Crusader Industries. So you can see like it's kind of through line of how these things are happening that affect us today in Star Citizen. So after all the dust settled down, Linton was declared Mezer the 11th, became the reigning imperator, and almost immediately started screwing up. One of the first major things that would happen is the Akiri-Cray Treaty was signed. Secretly, behind the Imperator's back, Senator Akiri from Terra had been meeting with Emperor Cray and on Tohill, in the Tohill system, where they were negotiating a peace treaty. And Senator Akiri managed to get the treaty signed and bring it before the Senate to get voted on before Linton knew what was going on. And the Senate actually passed the peace treaty, meaning that it was up to the Imperator to sign it in order to end the centuries-long Cold War with the Xi'an. And Linton refused to sign it. So, after three measures, which had led to disastrous military defeats, internal turmoil, ending in multiple assassinations and coups, we see the very last measure denying the one thing that the Measures had been holding on to for so long to keep them in power, which was fear of the alien, fear of the Xi'an. This likely was the spark that would move to the end of his reign, because Linton, in his process of becoming imperator, cleaned up his mess, went through and had the advocacy hunt down all of the rebels that his sister had trained to have them disappeared or killed so that they wouldn't pose a threat to his own reign. Obviously, they didn't know that they were working for Linton. They just thought they were trying to overthrow the emperor, the imperator. A good example of this would be StarCraft 2 story, where you see, the son of Arcturus Minx, works with Raynor, even though that's kind of dynamic is what's going on there. But Lydia had designs of her own and had hidden many of her rebels away from the advocacy, so to use when she thought was a good time to strike and then become the imperator herself. Likely, it was her who discovered footage of one Garin 2. Garin 2 was a planet that had been sold terraforming rights to a company which was in control of one of the cousins of Linton. Garin 2 was a planet that had a sentient species living on board the planet, or on the planet. Primitive, but sentient. And Linton gave the green light to terraform that planet, which genocided the entirety of that species off the face of the universe.
Happy Liminalia.
Happy Liminalia.
And the hits just keep on rolling.
The 28th century is very, very bleak in human history. It's a very bleak time. The footage, of course, was smuggled out of these aliens gasping for air as the atmosphere was being changed and them slowly suffocating to death. This footage was smuggled out of Garin and got into the hands of Lydia's rebels, who are now calling themselves the Tide. The Tide then broadcast this footage to the entire UEE, using the information that they had learned from their time being trained by UEE militaries on how to hijack signals for their own usage. The UEE military immediately locked down all of the transportation and communication relays to try to quell any kind of response. At the same time as this footage went out, many of the more legal political radicals staged protests pre-planned to against the Measures as a coordinated effort between all of these different rebel groups, these old resistance groups. And these resistance groups were brought down. These protests were handled very brutally. The UE military was called out to shoot the protesters. But unlike previous times when stuff like this had happened, footage of these things, including the Vale massacre, were broadcast again throughout the UEE, even though the military had locked down communications, because the rebels had been piggybacking their signals through official messages so that they weren't detected. So they were able to send messages back and forth throughout these systems, even though nobody else could. So the military was experiencing a coordinated attack on multiple fronts by rebel insurgents and fell apart. They just didn't know what to do. The morale had already been on the floor. There was at least one squadron of bombers that only a couple of months before had refused to attack a civilian target and were already in prison. The Thundering Thorshoes had actively gone against orders intentionally. So the military started to turn on itself, many military members joining the rebels, and the Senate, who had long, especially from Terra, who had long desired for the end of the Mezzer regime, backed the rebels, and it culminated with rebels, outlaws, former current military, and senators charging the imperial palace, and in a firefight ended up killing Linton Mezzer. And in the aftermath, the one Aaron Toy addressed the UEE, saying that that Mezzers were dead, that Linton Mezzer had died, and that she was now the imperator of the UEE, leading to the kind of beginnings of the new UEE that we currently are in the Star Citizen universe. So as we can see, the Mezzers did not really collapse because of outside influences, really. They collapsed from their own routine miscalculation of their own situation, a miscalculation of their power, a miscalculation of what people were willing to take, and their own stupidity in dealing with literally giving the people the gun that would murder them with, that they would be murdered with.
Yeah, they did a lot of dumb
So, yeah.
Paul, smaller Ross, I think you said Lydia at one point. It's
it's Fiona.
Fiona.
I always call her Lydia for some reason. I said Fiona at the very beginning, and then I see Lydia, because I know Lydia Mezzer was a thing. But
every year at Invictus, they put up this timeline, and they still refer to Corson Messer as Corbin Messer. And as in, it's in-game. It's an in-game thing. It's like, they're just that same typo every year.
Yeah.
Same item. It's like, please, fix the typo next year. Please.
No, we're just changing his name. He's actually Corbin, not Corson.
Oh, that won't be viewed weirdly by British political press, will it?
So, yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear throughout this that the Mezzers were not a good leaders. They were not good leaders, and I think it's very important to remember that, like, not just like were they the bad leaders because they were horrible dictators, but they also really didn't get things done. One of my leading theories about the technological stagnation of the UEE, because people always bring this up, why is the Star Citizen universe so backwards compared to even, in some cases where we are today? Why don't we have AI? Why don't we see all these sorts of things? And the answer is because of the Mezzers. The Mezzers had created such an atmosphere of fear and retaliation that you don't think outside the box, because the box is there to keep you from going into a black bag. People were more focused on politically trying to counter or reduce the Mezzers, and the Mezzers in return were trying to find new crazy ways of making better weapons, not necessarily better communications technology or better travel technology. So we see this kind of almost technological, economic, and social slump for about 200 years, which we're now starting to see the UEE sort of pull out of because of the creation of new companies who aren't as closely tied to the government itself. And with less stringent regulations on what you can and can't research. So, like for instance, I think it was Ulysses authorized the use of a project to turn terraforming lasers into WMDs. It never worked because it takes years for the terraforming lasers to actually function. But it was a billions of credits tossed into this essentially money pit of a project that never fully worked and left just a bunch of random, because you had to build these lasers in station or like in system. You can't like build them and ship them in. You have to build them because you can't move them. They left these stations in the system, which were eventually converted into the ARC. The ARC station, which is where the ARC star map comes from. It's where, and it was turned basically literally beating weapons into plowshares, swords into plowshares by turning this weapon of mass destruction into a giant library. So to show you kind of the difference between the Mezzers and the modern UE.
To be honest, I think it's really interesting to see how much of their followers really just brought on by themselves. I mean, yeah, they were fighting wars and they had some problems, but like the fact that so much of what happened to them wasn't started by outside of their own borders is pretty, like, come on, guys.
Yeah, if anything, their border situation, the main relevant border situation to all of this, the Vandal were always going to come regardless what we were doing. But they basically created this wall with the Xi'an, and we discussed this a lot in our previous episodes, and the Xi'an were always standoffish, but there wasn't any really like animosity per se. There was just caution, and it was the Messers who decided, we're going to turn this into animosity so that we can use that fear to control our people. So even that kind of external thing was of their own creation. But it's another one of those examples of where one of the early clever good Messers came up with a great idea. We'll use the fear to control the populace. We'll set up some political prisons. These are all great things for controlling the populace. And it's the later inept ones who turn that into complete stupidity.
It'd be interesting to know whether, had we encountered the Vandal earlier, would humanity have taken that Cold War frontage with the Xi'an, or would we have just, we've got the Vandal, we don't need to worry about the Xi'an because they're the big bad guys. But that's, I think, something that would need to be delved in at a different time and a different discussion. It was interesting as we were looking at the fall of Orion, Tiber, and Virgil. Like, they are some of the earliest settled systems as we looked at one of our earliest law citizens. These were old human systems when the Vandal attacked them and took them. And the siege of Tiber, where they were going for those surgical strikes, that system was working. And one of the reasons it actually fell apart was, I believe, the admiral who was kind of leading those that actually got killed in one of the confrontations, and the new admiral was a doofus. And so you see that having an impact as well. The certain leaders being killed at certain times really totally unsettled the whole front line and gave way to the Vandal just being able to swarm through and do what they do.
Yeah, it's interesting to see that the UEE military is almost always painted, and I do wonder if this is intentional, or if we'll see a little bit of kind of different painting depending on who you're looking at it. The UE military is almost always seen as trying to do the right thing at the moment, but usually either just naive or just didn't have enough support from the Mezzers. They're almost always the good guys in the stories of the Mezzers, from the standoff at Hador to, like, they're almost always the ones who are like, we're trying to de-escalate situations. It's the Mezzers who are getting things worse. And it might be the case. Plenty of military leaders are concerned about their own men's lives. They don't want to throw their own people's lives away for nothing.
Even the story of the bomber, the AI bomber.
Yeah.
Its names eluded me, but the idea of was, if this is going to enable us to get some of our guys who've been on the front line forever to not be here and be able to go home, and they've gone awry. We better hunt them down and destroy them all.
I think to a certain extent, we take it more from a sort of like literary criticism thing. The way that the military is written in like the Star Citizen universe is kind of an idealized American view of the military as this meritocratic and fundamentally principled thing that if they're ordered to do something, they might, they're not above reproach, but in ideal, they're people of honor with a code of rules that is going to be used against tyrants, rather than an impression that we've had of militaries in Europe over history, where it's all sort of toffs who bought their commissions and they're sending, their good men off to die. And I think Star Citizen isn't necessarily trying to challenge the idea of that kind of ideal of the military as a principled force and a meritocratic and competent one.
I'm wondering though how much of that is intentional, or how much of that is the perspective that we're only seeing is from the UEE and from a military who sided with the people at the right moment, so they want to make themselves look good.
I was going to say, it sounds like the UEE is the one writing this.
Yes.
Oh, it is. The history is all from the UEE.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that even though the Measures were overthrown, the Measures weren't overthrown necessarily because they didn't like the idea of the UEE and the centralized control that they would have, but it's much more because the Measures were idiots and they were making them look bad and they were making them lose money and control. So they just made the wrong enemies at the wrong time. And you can see this because almost directly after the fall of the Measures, there's this debate on the Government Reformation Act, I think is what it was called, where they were going to completely overhaul the UEE and create the Democratic Stellar Union. And it failed because half of the empire were concerned that this would cause too much change. They just didn't like the Measures. They didn't necessarily dislike the UEE. They just didn't like the Measures. So it's that kind of like, oh, I'm not a, possibly former, Measure loyalists who kind of turned at the right moment. They're like, oh, well, I worked for them until the things got bad. And now I'm no longer wanting to be associated with this, but they're still active in the government. So we still see this kind of, especially if you look at the perspective of many of the people who actually had orchestrated this revolution in the first place, many of them didn't return to the UEE. Even people like August Dunlop left the government after how ineffective it was at change, and formed Crusader Industries as essentially a company designed to change the world, where the money they made selling ships was just an excuse. It was essentially the weirdest way of funding a nonprofit aid program that anyone has ever seen. Sell bombers to make money to feed children, kind of thing.
Yeah, I really find that the Crusader lineup of ships that we've got in game really doesn't fit with the whole lore behind the company.
Yeah, they kind of decided it was for a long time it was all going to be just like a very industrial manufacturer, and then they suddenly decided, actually, we kind of like this style, we want something a bit more military, and they kind of just backed off that idea, I guess.
Yeah, but it really was that idea of supporting, like even today, most of their profits get funneled back into Angeli's Angels and other humanitarian companies or concerns, and the ships we've got for Crusader just don't seem to fit the Ares bomber, the Ares fighters, the A2 bomber. To me, they're outliers of what Crusader is. They're almost opposed to what Crusader stands for. But
yeah, I think ultimately they need to write around. I felt that when they announced those ships, they was sort of changing what the character of that company, and I think the writing probably needs to catch up with those ships essentially. Yeah, but I think it's really interesting, just to quickly return to a point of what is absent from this whole discussion is we've been talking a lot about how the Messers were involved with different corporate interests and how they had political corruption and all this other kind of corruption, putting governors in place. But there's no mention really of them ever sort of having their pocket admirals and and like, oh, the Messer that was, head of the Marines because he was a Messer, which is, I mean, it's literally still a thing that we do in the UK, and it's just it's interesting that they kind of have written this sort of incorruptibility of the military into a story full of corruption. I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think it also comes with the fact that the military is its own branch of the government in the UEE and always has been. So where it's much easier to get, like, even the senators didn't really like the UEE. It's like the only people who really went along with the Messers were the advocacy. It seems like because even the senators, like you'd have the High Secretary who would obviously be a Mezer or a Mezer loyalist, but you still had active senators who, like a Cray, who were working against the Mezer interests, who were just too powerful or too influential to just throw away into a jail because it would cause a revolution. And I think the same kind of thing happened with the Mezers, though I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of the admirals who were involved in the fall of Orion were pocket Mezer loyalists who just didn't know what they were doing and relied on.
Who knows?
So we don't have any accounts or stories about Mezers in small and lower roles. Like there's no real stories about them trying to manipulate any of the other branches and getting people into these roles of power. It sounds like you're saying, Joe.
Not currently. I mean, apart from basically we've discussed all the messes here, every single one that is mentioned, and even Gammon Messer, a name which in British slang kind of sounds like ham fucker, is.
Oh boy!
I did point that out to the law team, and they considered it and decided to keep the name. So ham fucker.
Appropriate for a messer.
Yeah, he's pretty much like the least influential messer that we talk about because he was kind of probably going to become emperor, and he was involved in the light correctional facilities. But that's all he did. So yeah, they don't seem to have been a particularly expansive dynasty because, well, you don't want to write 50 characters who didn't do anything. But
and the other thing is the law team, even though they are like, there are two things they do. One, they're writing from the UEE or human perspective of history. So we don't know the Xeon side of law. We get occasional bits law. We get the Emperor's speech. We don't see the Banu side. We see humans' reaction or humans' view of the human side. We don't see the Vandal side. We see the human reacting to what's happening.
And we rarely even see like the People's Alliance of Levski. We don't know what they think of the whole thing. We don't know what the people of Cathcart think about, or the Nexus system, or the Tavaran. The Tavaran outside the UE, we really have no perspective on. And even the Tavaran in the UE are very critical of the UEE. Emperor, or the current senator from
Senator Toy from
Elysium.
The actual homeworld of the Tavaran.
Yeah, he's even very critical of the UE and how they're doing, how they handle things like even Tavaran artifacts in the what is it called, the Cabal system. But even it's very rare. Like we don't see a lot of perspective, and so it's important to remember that when we're talking about the fall of the Mezers, is that this is written from the perspective of the winners, and nobody else. So we have yet to really see, maybe we'll see it in game, like what the people of Levski, think about the new UEE. In fact, I remember there's an old line of dialogue that I'd heard from the ATC operator of Levski, who I'm blanking on his name, but there were some dialogue options that hadn't been met in there yet, which was discussing with him. He's like, yeah, man, one day I haven't been to a concert in years. I guess we have to wait until we liberate all the people of Earth and bring down the corporations before we can get back to feeling the music, man, or something like that. So, and it always struck me as like, even the people of Levski hate the UEE. Like that's the reason why, like, even though the Mezers were gone, it's not like suddenly all of these people who had left the UE came running back. A lot of them stayed there.
You even look at Charon 3.
Yeah.
Charon, even though Charon 3 is a UEE affiliate, it's kind of still controlled by the UEE. The UE kind of say, yeah, you're part of us. But they've rejected, as a planet, they rejected UE recognition. They reject, and part of that is because one of the Mezers, I can't remember which one, actually, when, I think it was, I'm not going to try and guess, but when they expanded the prison system, and the population got to a point, they took a decree to the Senate and said, you're going to acknowledge Charon 3 as a UE member, and this is going to be their senator. And the UE, the Senate went, okay. But after the fall of Linton, the Charon 3 population basically said, "No, we're done. We can't stand you guys. You're corrupt and everything else, and you just stand for what the measures stand for." Which I kind of think is a bit rich for them, considering they had really ridden financially and economically and everything.
Yeah.
Their whole world's economy and fortunes had risen on the benefits of being Meza prison camp.
Continuous revolution. Bring down the organs of power.
Yes, comrade.
So yeah, that's I think that's the thing. Any other questions there?
I think those comments from Jale are very much like my barkeeper. He tends to like this revolutionary idea.
Overthrow the Mezzers, overthrow the Hurstons. They're the last vestiges of Mezzer rule. That's all I'm going to say.
No, I actually think the last vestiges of Mezzer rule are actually
Xenothreat. Yeah.
They are Mezerites, and I wouldn't be surprised if our missing Mezzer is actually somewhere tied up in there.
Yeah, I forgot to mention that no one knows what happened to Fiona. She disappeared. There's no confirmed. She just not confirmed dead. She disappeared when her pet rebels turned on her and basically said, "No, we're running this revolution now." She just vanished.
Disappeared. And Mezerite and the Xenothreat really are picking up Mezerite philosophy of fear of the alien. So what happened to all those pocket admirals of the Mezzers? I think they're Xenothreat guys. They're over in Pyro, running Pyro Station, and that's why the other mobs can't take over, because you've got real military.
I hope some of them are mission givers and significant just characters out there in the game. I think, if anything, this has definitely made me more curious to hear different perspectives of the lore.
And the other aspect of lore, not only is it from a UEU perspective, but the lore team deliberately do broad brushstrokes, so they can actually fill in details later on as the game goes. So we've got two things that limit our knowledge. One, it is only from a human UEU perspective, and two, the lore team are deliberately doing broad brushstrokes as much as they can, so that they can fill things in, or so that there's stuff for us to find in game. And so, which makes doing lore podcasts quite fun, because you've got to delve in and
find the pieces,
find what you can.
Yeah, I like that.
But you're right. There's a lot of material that they can work with, and we hope that that will be capitalized upon.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, with that, let's thank you for joining us again. Make sure that if you're watching this on YouTube, you hit that follow button. If you're listening to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or anywhere else this is, you can hit that follow there as well. Kind of sign up for us, comment down below. Let us know your thoughts on everything. Thank you, Tomato, for joining us for this one. Hopefully we'll see you next time.
Happy to be here.
Let's make sure that you're following Tomato and Jale and Al, with the info runners and all these sorts of things. And like I say every time, hope to see you someday in the black.